Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cypress Comp stage. If you have ever had to coordinate tests across multiple repos, you know that things can get complicated really fast. Our next speaker, Koen van Bell, test automation engineer, managing partner at Be Ignited, and Cypress ambassador, is here to talk us through the good, the bad, and occasionally cursed world of multi-repository setups. He's going to share with us what actually works and what to avoid, and I cannot bring him on stage until I shout out the Be Ignited team who is hosting their third annual Cypress Conf watch party. Hello, Be Ignited team. It is great to be back on your screens in your conference room, and I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. And now, without further ado, to fill your conference screens, I want to bring Koen van Bell up on stage, so please join me in welcoming. Come on up, Koen.
Hey, hello everyone.
Hey, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here so you can share your screen and get started.
Yeah, let me quickly share screen, which is weird. Wait. Ah. Everybody can see the slides. So I want to share with you guys my story about how I changed from mono repositories to multi-repositories. But first, who am I? Jenna already told everyone I'm a full stack tester. I'm a co-managing partner at Be Ignited, who are almost all watching. I'm a Cypress ambassador, and I'm an avid teacher of anything testing related. And I am the parent of 2.8 children. There's nothing weird there. One of the kids is still being developed. We're expecting him by the end of December. And then mandatory, I am also a NeoVim user. Apparently, when you get into the community, you have to mention it anytime you can. Where do I work? So I work for Be Ignited. We're a very small, dedicated company, and we do full stack testing. And then the project. I work as a consultant, and I work at the Flemish government for the Department of, and now I have to cheat, it's the Department of Work, Economy, Science, Innovation, and Social Work. That's quite of a mouthful. In essence, what do? We try to get money to citizens that want to work and that want to learn, and we want to improve workplaces and the work quality. So you want to make it more pleasant to work in Flanders. The actual project itself that I'm going to talk about was the Susta tool. So it's a dashboard to see if you're a sustainable organization. In essence, it was a questionnaire in which you can assess the sustainability of your organization itself. So best practices, how we test at Flanders. You have monorepos, that's a repository, single framework with single responsibility. So one framework for each type of testing. So one framework for API testing, one for UI testing. Very low amount of dependencies. We try to keep it as small as possible. And we use a test data controller. The number one rule everyone always should handle is to keep it simple, stupid. Traditionally, we do it like this. So we have UI testing in Node.js with TypeScript, Cypress, obviously. We do API testing with Java Spring Boot, Rest Assured, and Cucumber. And then we have the test data controller in Java Spring Boot. What is the test data controller? The test data controller just handles any type of data that we need in setup. So it injects it directly into the database. It clears the database. Any type of database interaction you want, you do it in the test data controller. Why? We want the tests to be responsible for their own data. So this is how it looks. I like to make drawings. I spend more time thinking about how I'm going to structure my framework than actually writing my framework. So I have a lot of drawings on my desk, next to my desk, on Alexidraw, to make sure that I have everything right. And it looks like this. So you have the UI tests, they go to the test data controller, and then they test the front end. You have the API test data controller again, and they go to the backend. Makes sense. I had an idea. We now have to manage two different frameworks, meaning we have to manage a lot of different dependencies, meaning we have to manage all our frameworks. We have to keep all those pipelines happy. We have to keep up to date with all those technologies. I wanted to change that. I wanted to go to the test application. I wanted to write a single test framework that could handle both front-end and back-end tests in one spot, so I could manage the dependencies better and I have more control about what I'm doing. I decided to do this with Node.js, TypeScript, Cypress, of course, the Apollo client for our GraphQL calls, which is something Meta invented a few years back, and Vitest to validate. The data, you ask, because there is no longer any talk about a test data controller. I didn't want to use one. I wanted to go a step further and take a bit of a risk. For all the data, the backend will provide. So all the API calls that the backend can accept will handle all data creation. I will just use the user API calls to create, to delete, to modify anything my front-end tests need and anything I need in the API tests, which was a bit of a risk. So it looked like this. This was the plan. One repository to test the application, the backend will provide all data. It's never that simple. So reality hit me in the face, and it hit me quite hard. We have two different applications. So we have one application, our customer-facing application, that's the civilians. They are able to log in, they are able to do actions, they are able to interact with the application. And then you have the employee-facing, so the government employees, that are able to create, that are able to modify two different applications. Okay, damn. New plan. We have two repositories for both applications. Okay. It's never that simple, so reality hit me again. We need data that we can create in the employee-facing, in the customer-facing part, and the customer-facing can edit that data and use it in the employee-facing part. Okay, new plan, the new plan. I again go to one application, and I use the backend of the employee-facing application to provide for the customer-facing application. There is no other way. Okay, downside, it's no longer a simple application. It does quite a lot, and it has to manage quite a lot. So what are my benefits? What did I win in my adventure? So for the benefits, I don't have any duplicate code. I can write very generic tests, and I have a lot of dynamic tests. Why? Because I have control of the data, and it's quite easy to add new tests. For the GraphQL calls that I enter on API level, I can now do schema validation in Cypress. And I have real end-to-end tests. And that's where I'm quite proud of the whole test application. Every test in that application is a full end-to-end test without sacrificing speed, without sacrificing quality, without sacrificing stability. It was, in short, what I dreamt about. It was great. It was amazing. We actually were able to pinpoint deficiencies in the application because I did it like this. Weaknesses. We had one API call that kept failing. It broke the entire framework, and it showed the risk that one API call was. It showed how brittle that point was. It's great. There were drawbacks, obviously. One of the drawbacks is it became fairly complicated. We have multiple configurations, and you have to keep your attention to it. It became a very large framework, and if not everything was in its right spot, you could lose track of things quite fast. So, which problems did I encounter in creating this? The file structure was quite difficult. The Cypress configuration, well, that was okay, but it took some thought. The pipelines, I required some preprocessors, and you have that dreaded shared folder. The utils folder, the common, the utilities, the support folder. Yeah, always a dangerous one. So how did I handle this? First, the file structure. As you can see, I have the test application, and it contains three major folders: the customer-facing, employee-facing, and shared. In the customer-facing, I had the Cypress tests, I had the APIs, employee facing the same, Cypress and APIs. And in the shared, I had a bit of the same. I had Cypress page objects that were defined, like the header and footer. I had a lot of API calls defined, like the login, stuff like that. So first, Cypress config. So 3 total configs. I had 1 global config, and I was able to import that as quickly as this. So that's easy. It's quickly solved. Each facing application had its own config, and they all inherited from the global one. Great. Next, the pipelines. Okay, each time the developers deployed, they wanted to have it all checked. That's quite hard because each pipeline has to test its own application. Each time customer-facing APIs changed, we needed to test only the APIs. How are we going to do that? Well, some very ugly package.json magic. I know it's quite difficult to read, bear with me. So the first two just call vtest on a specific application, in this case, back and front application, which is employee facing and customer facing respectively. Next, you have the UI tests back and front, which can run headless. And the one beneath that is for extra reporting reasons. So with just a bit of package.json magic, I could take it away. It's very clearly abuse of what it should be, but yeah, it works and it works great. Next, preprocessors. Cypress did not handle playing with vtest and the GraphQL files really well. But as soon as I added the vit preprocessor, I gained a bit of speed and I was able to handle all GraphQL files, which was great as well. And we could continue. Lastly, we had the shared folder. The shared folder, I'm always a bit scared of it. Why? Because it can explode in size. I don't know where to put it. Let's put it in shared. Let's dump it there in a corner in a bench. Nobody sees it, nobody cares about it. But that's not how I want to handle that. I want to define something that is shared like that. It is really shared. It exists in all different applications at the same time. I have a few rules for this. I'm going to share with you 2 of them. The first one is consistency is key. At some point, I make a rule, this goes in shared. And that rule is now holy. There is no exception, ever. Why? Because I need to find something back. As soon as I make an exception to a rule, I will not be able to find it back in my framework. So once I define something as this is shared, it will always be shared, and anything that looks like it will be in shared. That easy. The next step, it's a bit counterintuitive. You need to keep it small, and preferably a lot smaller. The shared folder can quickly become kind of a garbage can. It shouldn't be. You should try to keep away of making it the garbage can of your framework. Always be mindful of what you put in there, just to keep your framework as easy as possible to use. And then I have to admit something. I failed to keep it simple. I kind of failed miserably at this. At some point, I had to give my framework to someone else. And when I showed that colleague, they responded with, this is not easy. And she was right. For me, it became a very easy framework because I had logical steps to build on. You saw how I evolved. Step 1, I did this. Step 2, the new plan. It was all logical steps, all very incremental small changes. And after a year, I had to turn it in. And I thought, this is a great framework, very happy, quite easy to add tests. Okay, let's start by writing the handover documentation. This is not an easy and simple framework. Damn. In the end, the framework took a bit of explaining, but it was fine. It wasn't that big of a deal. But yeah, I broke my number one rule, which is something that in my next framework I will keep in mind. Try to do the same thing because I'm very happy on how it turned out. It was, for me, a pleasure to work in this application. Um, when I make a new one, I'll try to keep it simpler, to try to do better. And that's what I wanted to end this talk on. Do innovate, change, make something new. And if it's not better, I saw in the comments, if it's not better, make a new plan. And if it's not better, make another plan and keep going until you have that innovation that drives you forward. Stay curious, stay getting better. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. I know I wrapped up a bit early, but I kind of hoped that there would be questions.
Okay, Cohen. Thank you for sharing that. I think well, we're all suffering from flashbacks currently of that one shared folder everyone knows. So I think you evoke those emotions in all of us. I also really love the new plan and the thread in chat that went on to the nth degree new plan. So that was a key moment for me. We do have one comment in Q&A right now. I would encourage everyone to, if they have questions, drop them into that Q&A pod. I do want to bring this first one up on screen. So you mentioned using preprocessors. So can you give a little bit of context around what a preprocessor is for those in the audience who haven't interacted with that kind of technology before?
Yeah, so the preprocessor is what will keep files or objects in memory before the actual tests start. We used GraphQL. GraphQL is a schema that you then have to translate into the actual API call. And we couldn't do that translation in Cypress itself. It required the preprocessor of vtest, or any preprocessor would have worked. But since I used vtest, I kind of thought it was logically to use the vtest preprocessor. So that's it. It just loads the files before Cypress triggers, and that enables you to, for instance, handle the fixtures differently. Cypress gives multiple ways to handle fixtures. If you add a processor, you have another way of handling fixtures. If it's better, I don't know, but I needed it in the case of the GraphQL calls.
Excellent. I have another question for you that I'm going to share on stage. Why did you use Vite for API calls instead of Cypress itself for API calls? Does it make the framework more complex if those API calls are used in Cypress UI test, which has a specific style of coding with the clause, the then clause? Apologies.
Yeah. There are two reasons. I wanted to have some separation of responsibility still. So I wanted to use vtest. Why? Because it just programs a bit easier. Vtest has that hot reload that I like. You can type your API call, you save the file, and vtest is already testing the API call. It's a great workflow that you can just keep working, you keep getting feedback, you don't have to switch screens, you don't have to type an additional command. You just have vtest running, and it keeps going, it keeps going. So that's one reason why I chose vtest. Another reason is I don't really like how the API calls work in Cypress. I don't like the whole .then chaining. I think it makes it a bit unreadable or more difficult to read, especially when you're chaining a lot of API calls. In the end, you had to consider that I was creating all the data, which were multiple API calls, before I started the Cypress tests. So I had a before each that contained, not collapsed, I think 50, 60 lines. Yeah, okay, if I start adding the .then and all that clauses and all the asyncs, that's going to be really ugly to read. So I prefer to make helper functions in shared for all the API calls and then just call them. It was a bit easier, it was a bit cleaner. That's the reason.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we have another question, so I'm going to get that one shared up on screen as well. What are some key points to have in mind when creating a new framework from scratch?
For me, I'll go back to the first rule. it has to be simple. That's the number one rule that I will apparently violate multiple times. But I do try to keep it in mind. It has to be simple. It also has to be a pleasure to work. So I spent actually quite a lot of time looking for my quality of life in my framework. What do I like? Do I like working with this? Do I like working with that? Because if I'm happy to work in my framework, I'll be happy to go to work. I'll be happy to add code. That's something I definitely enjoy. Documentation is also a big part. Are the libraries that I'm going to use well documented? Do I have control over everything? I don't like libraries that do a lot of things behind the scenes. I like to know what's going on. I like to have control over what my framework does. When something goes wrong or I have a flaky test, I want to know fairly quickly why it's flaky. And that means you need to know what your framework does, so that you have to keep it simple, you have to know the libraries, the documentation has to be on point, stuff like that. So the major rule, keep it simple. Second rule, your own quality of life. And
I like
anything
that.
else flow from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thinking about as much time as we spend in our code bases day in and day out, I do love that you talked about your own quality of life, because that's not something you hear mentioned a lot when you're planning out how to start. You know, you're talking about performance, and you're talking about, you know, getting your test up and running quickly and speed. But oftentimes, like, that developer experience gets skipped over.
Yeah.
So I like that.
I recently, so in my client, I recently had to change projects. So now I'm not allowed anymore to work into my test application. I have to go back to the old way of working, which means I have to write Java again. I don't like writing Java. I really don't. So each time I have to do that, I feel demotivated is not really the word. It's all a bit more sluggish.
Mhm.
And yeah, I can't get Java to work in NeoVim, so that's a problem as well. I mean, it's out of my comfort zone. I have to use IntelliJ. I mean,
IntelliJ. Yeah. I mean, I hear you there. I mean, pull VS Code out of my fingers.
yeah.
You can't do it. I have one more question for you, and then we will wrap up for this session. I'm going to go ahead and share on screen, and this is a little bit outside of you know, what you've talked about, but you do work in a lot of different projects. So I'm sure you've had the experience of talking about, like, using this versus that. What approach do you take to talking to project stakeholders about why you use Cypress in a given project?
Um, One of the tricks I used was I re-automated a single test in Cypress, and then I ran the two side by side, and I usually could run the Cypress test again and again and again before Selenium finished. That's usually a big point. I talk about the ease of use, the fact that it's a still being developed application, that it still gets a lot of love. The documentation is great. There is a lot less flakiness, stuff like that. The advantages of Cypress versus Selenium are unending. You just have to know who you're talking with. If you're talking to techies, you can talk about how it's a lot more fun to use, how it's a lot easier to write tests, how the setup is a lot easier, how you're working a lot faster. If you're talking to, let's say, the IT manager, yeah, you can talk about how fast it is in the pipeline so that you reduce that cost, stuff like that. If you're talking about the CEO, you can have faster delivery, faster time to market, and all those nice words managers love to use. That in the case of Cypress is true.
That is awesome. I like all the different ways you presented that use case. It is time for us to wrap up our session here and move into the final session of today. And we are going to move into that session talking about quality engineering for continuous delivery. That session is starting at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, so just in a couple of minutes. I will see you over there. I want to say thank you to Cohen again for an amazing presentation, for answering a lot of great questions, and to the Be Ignited team for hosting that watch party and keeping the chat alive throughout the session. Thanks, folks, and thank Cohen.